Hi, my name is Sean Barnett. The information I'm sharing with you today came from a unique chain of events that I experienced this year. Now, many people played a role in this, but there are four in particular that I want to acknowledge before I begin. Joel Smith has been a friend of mine for nearly 30 years, and because of my history as a liar, criminal, and drug addict, and the fact that my wife and I have helped hundreds of others recover from the same ailments that I once suffered, Joel invited me to speak and engage with a panel of some of the greatest business minds in Salt Lake City to come up with solutions to addiction, recidivism, and homelessness in our community. I found out that there was another recovering addict that would also be speaking, and I wanted to coordinate to ensure that we wouldn't have identical speeches. His name is Sean Dixon, and he is fascinating. He told me about a book called Chasing the Scream by Harvey. The bulk of the information I'm here to share with you comes from this book, and I honor Johan for laying the groundwork for my work. And the last person I want to acknowledge is a man I recently had the privilege of spending some significant time with, Andrew Harvey. Andrew encouraged me that if there's anything so heinous and revolting that it makes me want to turn away, that this is part of my purpose on this earth. Andrew Harvey has inspired me to become a divine activist, which means using my voice with intense compassion for all human beings that suffer. Andrew sparked a fire inside of me that I now must honor. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "There comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but he must take it because his conscience tells him it is right." Now, we know that a small percentage of people exhibit atrocious behavior as a result of drug or alcohol use. But if we were able to go back in time to warn Woodrow Wilson that the Harrison Act would lead to millions of people being raped, tortured, and murdered, as well as eventually costing our country over $300 billion a year, do you think he might have vetoed that bill? Now, in America, until 1914, drugs were legal and unregulated. The Harrison Act of 1914 looked to regulate drugs, but they weren't criminalized until 1931. Bayer sold heroin before it sold aspirin. Cough medicine contained opium, and there was cocaine in Coca-Cola. In England, the classiest department stores sold tins of heroin to their high society clientele, yet only 2 to 5% of the population was addicted to drugs and alcohol, as opposed to 10% of today's population. So what happened? To answer this question, we must look at two relatively obscure yet critically important figures in American history, Harry Anslinger and Arnold Rothstein. Harry Anslinger was an assistant commissioner in the United States Bureau of Prohibition in 1929, and a year later he was named to the newly formed Federal Bureau of Narcotics. At that time, corruption was rampant within government prohibition agencies. Because Anslinger was perceived as an honest and incorruptible figure, he advanced quickly in both rank and political stature. But in 1933, when the U.S. passed the 21st Amendment repealing prohibition, both Harry and his department were facing a fate of both obscurity and insignificance. Harry was reportedly both a proud and paranoid man. His pride had been agitated along with the entire Bureau of Prohibition. They had become a sunken army. They had waged a war for 14 years against the suppliers of alcohol they had lost, big time. His paranoia was actually somewhat defensible. He was convinced that internal corruption within his agency was orchestrated by the mafia. And this is a suspicion which was later discovered to be accurate. And Harry became obsessed with proving to the world that the mafia was real. J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI at the time, was continually denying the existence of the mafia. And the irony of this is that while Harry was focusing all of his efforts on exposing the mafia, he wasn't spending time focused on the members of his own department. His focus on the external activities of gangsters actually opened the door for the mafia to infiltrate his department, and ultimately that's what enabled this crime organization to flourish. It was a case of the cat being so busy hunting for rats in the front yard that the rats were simply able to waltz through the back door. Now, the nastiest rat at the time was named Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein was the person who first realized that prohibition was a business opportunity. This was a means to enormous wealth. According to crime writer Leo Katcher, Rothstein transformed organized crime from a thuggish activity by hoodlums into big business, run like a corporation, with Rothstein himself at the top. Rothstein can be credited as the pioneer of organized crime. His model of business that was created during Prohibition is followed by basically every cartel in the world today. Plata o plomo, silver or lead. Take our bribe or take a bullet. Now, around the same time that Americans were waking up to the fact that Prohibition was an ill-considered program, the Supreme Court ruled that drug use outside of alcohol, which was still legal at the time for all intents and purposes, should be regulated by doctors, not cops. Now, this led to a slashing of $700,000 to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics budget. So, faced with the belief that he would become insignificant, Harry Anslinger vowed to eliminate the existence of all drugs. Within 30 years, he turned his crumbling department into the headquarters for a war that has taken more lives and been the catalyst for more heinous crimes of torture, rape, and child abuse than any single event in human history. Harry went about this task by initially issuing propaganda that seems laughable today. Yet, many people still pass on beliefs taught by their parents who were the victims of these lies. Here was what Harry had to say about weed. By the tons it is coming into this country, the deadly, dreadful poison that racks and tears not only our body, but the very heart and soul of every human being who becomes a slave to it in any of its cruel and devastating forms. Marijuana is a shortcut to the insane asylum. Smoke marijuana cigarettes for a month, and what was once your brain will be nothing but a storehouse of horrid specters. Hashish makes a murderer who kills for the love of killing out of the mildest mannered man who ever laughed at the idea that a habit could ever get him. In another publication, Harry said, an entire family was murdered by a youthful addict in Florida. When officers arrived at the home, they found the youth staggering about in a human slaughterhouse. With an axe, he had killed his father, mother, 2 brothers, and a sister. He seemed to be in a daze. He had no recollection of having committed the multiple crimes. The officers knew him ordinarily as a sane, rather quiet young man, but now he was pitifully crazed. They sought the reason. The boy said he had been in the habit of smoking something which youthful friends called muggles, a childish name for marijuana. As Harry made more progress on convincing the public that these effects of marijuana, that these were real effects of marijuana, his racism began to bleed into this propaganda. He once said, colored students at the University of Minnesota were partying with white female students smoking marijuana and getting their sympathy with stories of racial persecution. The result? Pregnancy. In another account, he said, 2 Negroes took a girl, 14 years old, kept her for 2 days under the influence of hemp. Upon recovery, she was found to be suffering from syphilis. Now, besides this deep hatred for the mafia, Harry harbored a deep hatred for African Americans. Jazz music was the antithesis of everything which Harry stood. It was free, liberating, unrestrained. Harry made it clear that Billie Holiday, Louis Armstrong, Charlie Parker, and Thelonious Monk were niggers that don't know their place, and he set out to see them behind bars. And it was apparent that seeing them dead would have suited Harry just fine, as he instructed his officers to shoot first when engaging in drug raids. Under Anslinger's tenure, the caliber of gun used by police was increased. The reasoning, according to Harry, that cocaine nigger is sure hard to kill. Now, prior to the civil rights movement, The majority of whites in America either hated blacks or wanted to ignore the fact that they were being locked into slums. It's amazing how closely this reflects the views of today's society concerning drug addicts. The majority of our society either hates addicts or wants to ignore the fact that they're being caged and raped at a colossal pace. Now, back in Harry's time, blacks weren't the only ones on Harry's radar. The Orientals, Harry claimed, had developed a liking for Caucasian women, and they would lure them into their opium dens to turn them into sex slaves. Harry would describe in great detail how the Chinese had a plan to get all whites addicted to drugs and then laugh in their face and take over the world. The yellow race will soon rule the world, he claimed. Now, soon, ordinary citizens were killing Asians. Today, anyone with half a brain knows that marijuana, opium, or cocaine isn't going to turn you into a sex-craved rapist or a murderer. But it's amazing how much of the fear created during the 30s and 40s is still prevalent in the thoughts of today's society 80 plus years later. What's even crazier is that doctors in the 30s and 40s repeatedly spoke out against the policies of Anslinger's fearmongers. Multiple doctors claimed that Anslinger treated scientific questions about drugs the same way these questions were addressed in the Middle Ages. While scientists today have shown repeatedly that incarceration is ineffective in treating drug addiction, society remains stuck in this witch hunt mentality. Even the majority of the addiction recovery community holds on to primitive beliefs in the face of evidence that faith-based recovery is highly effective. Why? Easy money with lots of repeat customers. But doctors who believed in science and evidence in Harry's time weren't just rebuked after Prohibition failed. They were labeled as communists. They were also accused of advocating for the rape of women, as stories passed around that one hit of LSD would cause girls to lose consciousness for 2 days while fraternity boys repeatedly raped them. Finally, in 1962, JFK's administration conducted a thorough investigation of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and found it to be corrupt to its core. Not only were its members paid to protect and facilitate the movement of huge shipments of narcotics, they were also responsible for the production of the majority of false propaganda about the harmfulness of drugs. So for years, the lies that Harry had been unknowingly professing as truth concerning the danger of drugs were being spoon-fed to him by the actual suspects of his crusade. So if you're asking yourself the question, why on earth would someone want to fuel a war against themselves? This would be a really good time to pay close attention to what I'm sharing with you. Please take this opportunity to engage in critical thinking. The war on drugs benefits criminals the most. The most heinous criminals on this planet are the leaders of the cartels and organized crime. Their lifeblood is money from the sale of illegal drugs. 80% of all murders on this planet are connected to the war on drugs. The sale of children into sex slavery rings is fueled by the war on drugs. If for no other reason than this, please let your voice be heard as you stand for the legalization of drugs. If you are interested in crippling organized crime, simply legalize drugs. What? You might ask, legalize drugs? How can I ask you to actually willingly allow people to take such harmful substances without putting them in a cage to be raped? Let's start by looking at alcohol, a legal substance. Alcohol is by far the most harmful of all drugs, according to the research that takes into consideration both harm to self as well as others. It ranks a 72 on a scale of 1 to 100, as opposed to heroin, which is 55, or crack, 54. Yet the majority of society uses it very responsibly. Only 9% of adult male drinkers and 5% of adult female drinkers become alcoholics. So why wouldn't we make alcohol illegal? Well, in case you missed it, we tried that. The facts are that during Prohibition, use of alcohol by children skyrocketed. Crime and murder skyrocketed. Alcoholism rates skyrocketed. People who preferred beer were now forced to drink White Lightning, as logistically and financially it only made sense to increase potency in order to smuggle the most alcohol in the smallest containers. If it's hard for you to believe that more kids would drink if it were illegal than legal, go ask any teenager today which is easier to get, alcohol or drugs. The fact of the matter is, drugs are easier for teenagers to obtain than alcohol today, because alcohol is legal and drugs are illegal. Anyone that has the ability to sell alcohol runs a real risk of losing that ability if they sell to a minor. A drug dealer has no increased risk to sell to a minor. In fact, drug addicts have a real interest in selling to minors. Drug addicts are fairly limited in their opportunities to make money, especially after they have a felony on their record. Generally, the top 3 options are prostitute, steal, or deal. Just ask yourself, which one looks more enticing? No one's out there trying to push cigarettes or alcohol on your kids. There's no profit in that, only risk. Drugs, on the other hand, have no increased risk and an incredible reward in terms of profit. When a rapist is taken off the streets, rape goes down in that area. Attack child molesters and molestation goes down. Take a drug dealer off the street and drug usage, murder, and violent crime spikes dramatically. Why? Money. It's all up for grabs every time a pusher loses his territory. The Harrison Act is the moment in time, through Harry Anslinger's hardline interpretation of the law, when control of drugs was passed from the government to thugs, gangsters, and criminals. For nearly 100 years, the people of this country have somehow ignored this fact. When Prohibition was repealed, Arnold Rothstein and his goons were reduced to leaning on people that owed money for gambling debts as their sole source of income. During Prohibition, they were making millions. It didn't take long for them to realize that if they could move massive amounts of alcohol for a profit, which was illegal, a much smaller product like heroin or cocaine would be 10 times more profitable. Profits were so high during Prohibition and following the militant interpretation of the Harrison Act that gangsters could actually outbid the salaries of law enforcement by enormous amounts. In 1929, journalists were reporting that police officers were more gracious to Rothstein than the police commissioner. This is why the mafia fed the lies that drugs were so dangerous to the American public. Fear-mongering, mixed with a hearty dose of racism, created the story that the majority of America still buys today. Have you ever stopped to wonder why white drug users outnumber black drug users 10 to 1, yet black inmates convicted of drug offenses outnumber their white counterparts 3 to 2? You may want to believe that racism is dead in America, but the facts, especially in regard to the war on drugs, tells a different story. It would be easy to assume that people who engage in the drug war choose to enter it, and whatever consequences they get are their own fault. Dealers, cops, and users all know that there are risks involved before they enter that arena. But have you ever taken the time to consider all the children that have been killed by stray bullets? Over 300 innocent people are struck by stray bullets every year. The Child Rights Network in Mexico, that other statistic was only in the United States. the Child Rights Network in Mexico estimates that 994 people younger than 18 were killed in drug-related violence between late 2006 and late 2010. Thousands of children as young as 10 years old are recruited into cartels worldwide every year. What do you think we are accomplishing by making drugs illegal? Only 10% of all drug users become addicted. The unharmed 90% of all drug users use their drugs in private. But the 10% makes up 100% of the picture craftily funded by the cartels that is being portrayed through the media. I know that people who make up that 10% can be some of the people that we love the most, and that sucks. But what are we accomplishing by imprisoning them? On Sheriff Joe Arpaio's watch in Arizona, there have been 157 deaths in prisons. Guards in Arpaio's jails and prisons have literally murdered prisoners with no consequences. Based on statistics, at least 120 people have lost their lives in Arizona jails because drugs interacted with their genetics differently than most people. Now, the easy argument is that all drugs are bad. The difficult argument is that, and this is supported by actual evidence, it's that most people get something good out of drugs. In fact, there's never been a society in human history where people didn't serially seek out altered states. Scientists have estimated that humans have been using plants to change their state of mind for over 13,000 years. George Washington insisted that American soldiers drank whiskey every day. William Shakespeare was very fond of cannabis. Sigmund Freud and Thomas Edison claimed that cocaine aided them in many of their discoveries. When I watch my one-year-old son spin around and around until he falls down and then giggles at the spinning world that he encounters, I realize that it is human nature to want to experience a variety of psychological states. Why do you think so many people love amusement parks? What happens during meditation or fasting? Why have we let the lies fed to us by organized crime continue to cloud our reasoning abilities after all these years? Now, don't think that I'm saying drugs are good. Drugs are bad. Sugar is bad. Drugs have an aspect that people enjoy. Sugar has an aspect that people enjoy. Drugs are a commodity, just like sugar. Sugar kills more people than drugs. Drug distribution is governed by criminals. Sugar distribution is in the hands of the government. Which one makes more sense? All of the research over the past 2 decades is pointing to the probability that addiction is tied to environment and connection with others and has very little to do with the drug. The majority of drug addicts suffer from childhood trauma. Science is showing us that stress experienced in the womb correlates significantly to drug addiction when that baby matures. Financial stress on a pregnant mother is shown to have a greater impact on a baby becoming a drug addict than the drug itself. Is it possible that we are sentencing people to being caged, raped, and killed because their mom was stressed out during her pregnancy? The answer you probably don't want to hear is yes. Now, my guess is that if you're listening to me right now, you don't believe in raping innocent children. I'm guessing that you don't think you should be put in a cage for being African, Asian, or of Latino descent. But now that you know the facts, if you don't do something about it, you are part of the problem. There is no getting around it. Martin Luther King put it best when he stated, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." I pray that you are now asking, what is the solution? Studies have been done in multiple cities and countries where heroin and crack addicts were given prescriptions for free drugs. In Merseyside, England, a doctor named John Marks was able to offer this service for 13 years. Crime immediately dropped 93% and remained at that level for the duration of his clinic. Hard drug use dropped 12-fold, from 207 people per 100,000 to 15 per 100,000. Shoplifting was reduced so dramatically that shop owners wrote to the local paper in droves about how much better life as a shopkeeper had become. It's funny how things change when someone doesn't need to steal $500 worth of goods to support a $50 habit. Parents who had first claimed that this was a crazy idea were now reporting that their estranged children were actually coming home for dinner. Dr. John Marks reported that during the time he was able to conduct this experiment, there was not even one death from overdose in 13 years. When the government shut him down in 1995, he had 450 patients. 20 were dead within 6 months. 41 had died in 2 years. Today, Merseyside, England is riddled with drug addiction, gangs, and murder. Dr. Marks was exiled from England, and now he lives in New Zealand. Please understand this concept. Free eliminates the pyramid scheme and the sales force of anything. All of a sudden, no one has to sell smack to get smack. Addiction on its own is not what is infectious in our society. It is actually the system of prohibition that makes it so. Now, it'd be easy to argue that prescriptions for drugs have failed as a model for helping drug addicts in the U.S. One could point to the astronomical rise in drug abuse with Oxycontin and Vicodin. One could say that these prescriptions lead to a dependence that ultimately becomes a heroin addiction. But you'd have to look a little closer, and then you'd see what actually happens. These patients are prescribed painkillers for certain ailments. A small percentage of them, mostly people who have experienced childhood or prenatal trauma, become addicted. When the doctor realizes that they have a problem, the doctor is bound by law to cut them off. This is when the patient is forced to seek relief from the street, and he either holds up a pharmacy or gets into the heroin game. It would be easy to blame Big Pharma greed on the increase in Oxycontin use. But evidence shows that availability of drugs actually decreases use. So why is there such an epidemic? Maybe it's the eradication of the middle class. This seems to be a common denominator. The biggest driver of addiction is stress. Economic stress and trauma make up the majority of the factors that are contributing to addiction in this country. The prohibition of drugs is actually creating a society where if you are a black man experiencing financial stress, you are sentenced to being raped in a cage. This is the first time in human history where a country exists where more men are raped than women. Now, I'm not saying it's any worse for men to be raped than women. I'm just pointing out that we are dealing with national insanity. I'm an advocate for this solution method to this epidemic. Group drugs into tiers and handle each tier differently. In tier 1, we'd have booze, tobacco, weed, cocaine, shrooms, acid, ecstasy, etc. There'd be no advertising or promotions allowed. The product would be sold in plain packages with health warnings, and all products would be sold through licensed vendors in dull designated stores, much like Utah liquor stores. Strict penalties would be enforced for operating a vehicle, behaving poorly in public, operating machinery, or performing any tasks that require a high level of concentration in order to be safe. Now, sales to minors would result in a revocation of the business license. Then, in tier 2, you'd have opiates, amphetamines, heroin. These would be administered by a network of doctors that were also armed with tons of resources to help with quitting. People under extreme financial duress could acquire these services for free. Then in Tier 3, you'd have crack and meth. These would be administered in a contained environment where the user would have to remain there until the drugs wore off. People under extreme financial duress could acquire these services for free as well. What we would be creating is a new regime where drug use is very boring. Instead of putting drug addicts into tent city, we'd be putting them in lovely centers. There's lots of other creative suggestions that I've seen, such as a license to do drugs, where if you behave badly, it is revoked. People could voluntarily opt out of being allowed to buy drugs if they had a problem. Many casinos have implemented a similar system where people with gambling problems tell on themselves and then they're not allowed in casinos. You could have an opt-in system where you would have to demonstrate that you understand the risks, you know how to deal with an overdose, and have an understanding of the drugs you'll be using, sort of like a driver's license. We could implement a system where people had to order their drugs in advance. That would limit impulsivity and encourage moderation. The solutions are infinite. It's only our fear and lack of imagination that keeps us in this nightmare of prohibition. Cigarettes are the most addictive substance of all of these that we're talking about. Ask any heroin addict which is more difficult to kick, and they'll tell you that it's cigarettes. So what led to a 50% reduction in cigarette smoking recently? Higher taxes, restricted areas of use, and an effective anti-smoking campaign. Can you imagine trying to criminalize cigarettes? What a joke that would be. Yet, somehow, it seems people believe that our war on drugs is some morally righteous child protection act. It is not. Any teenager will tell you that. If you really want to help your children, here's how you teach them Drug Education 101. A, don't do drugs. 2, if you do drugs, here's what I want you to know. That more than anything else, I want you to come home safely. What I really want for you is for you to have a happy life. Please think of safety first if you decide to do drugs. It's time that we turn our backs on this failing policy of prohibition and turn towards science, compassion, healthcare, and human rights. This heartless and idiotic policy of locking up drug addicts has to end. The fact is, you cannot support the prohibition of drugs without simultaneously supporting murder, rape, and child enslavement. And the fact is, the war on drugs is a war on abused and neglected children. We just don't put them in a cage until they grow up. I've made a simple pros and cons list here based largely off of the work of Johann Hari. Now, if anyone has anything to add to either side, please send me a message, and if it's valid, I'll add it to this. For legalization. Across the world, armed criminal gangs will be financially crippled. Murder will fall significantly. Rape will go down significantly. Enormous amounts of police time will be freed up to investigate other crimes. Trust in the police will return in poor communities. Teenagers will have a harder time getting drugs. Overdose will fall dramatically. HIV transmission will fall dramatically. The drugs people use will be milder. There will be significant increases in funds for treating addicts and dealing with the underlying causes of addiction. Many addicts that get worse behind bars will get better in hospitals and then in new jobs. Addiction will be reduced dramatically. Millions of people currently caged for nonviolent crimes will be free, which is an immense benefit to taxpayers. Huge numbers of African American and Latino men who are currently locked out of the workforce, student loans, and public housing will be able to be productive. Shaming addicts will be replaced by caring for them. Children will not be recruited to cartels. Services currently being used to deal with homeless populations can be used to deal with abuse, rape, neglect, etc. The U.S. would have over $350 billion each year to invest into educating our youth. Innocent lives currently killed by the fallout of the drug war will be saved. And on the other side, the reasons against legalization. Drug use will probably go up, and this is real, but probably not massively. Most likely this will be by older people and probably as a substitute for liquor or pills. Now, if you think I am minimalizing how many more people will try drugs if they're legal, please indulge me in this simple experiment. Ask yourself this: if today I came to you and said, guess what? Drugs are finally legal. Let's go smoke some crack. Would you do it? If I said, woohoo! Drugs are legal. Want to go trip out on some acid? Would you do it? If you said no, you are exactly like most people. If you said yes, you're already doing drugs. Please understand this concept. Hardly anyone does or doesn't do drugs because they are legal or illegal. So again, there are almost no benefits to having them illegal, and an incredible amount of benefits to having them legal. Now, if this has opened your mind or your imagination to the numerous possibilities that could arise from significant policy change within our government, please join me. I will post the transcript of this presentation on my blog at lifeofsean.com. You can also reach out to me through email at sean@alliswell.life. Now, I'm not sure how this will all shake out or what my role will be in changing our planet for the better, but I have intense gratitude for Andrew Harvey for inspiring me to get started. I have a deep desire to join the crusade to end sex trafficking, the abuse of women, children, and animals, economic injustice, and countless other atrocities taking place on this planet. But after being arrested 18 times over 27 years of being a drug addict, I have a pretty clear picture of what takes place in our corrections and treatment facilities, as well as what happens to the lives of people once they enter the system. So, since I know this arena better than anything else, I will start here. Thank you for listening to me. One love.